Black professor's lecture inspires generations campus abuzz with intellectual energy. The lecture hall fell silent as Professor Marcus Wilson stepped onto the stage. The usual shuffle of notebooks and whispered conversations ceased, replaced by an electric anticipation that seemed to charge the air. At 63, with salt and pepper hair and eyes that carried both wisdom and weariness, Professor Wilson commanded attention without demanding it. "Truth," he said, his deep voice resonating through the hall without the aid of a microphone, "is rarely comfortable." 100 pairs of eyes locked onto him. Among them was Eliza Chen, a freshman who'd heard rumors about this legendary lecture for months. She sat forward, pen poised over an empty page. "You've come to this university seeking knowledge," Professor Wilson continued, pacing slowly across the stage, his gaze sweeping across the diverse sea of faces. "But knowledge without the courage to face uncomfortable truths is merely information, and information without moral compass is just noise." He stopped, letting the words hang in the air. "Today I'm going to share with you the lecture that almost cost me my career 30 years ago, a lecture about power, prejudice, and the price of silence. Some of you will be uncomfortable, some of you will be angry, some of you might even walk out." As if on cue, a young man in the third row shifted in his seat, arms crossing defensively across his chest. "But those who stay," Professor Wilson's voice softened, becoming almost intimate, "will never see the world quite the same way again. And isn't that why you're here? Not for a degree to hang on your wall, but for a transformation that will shape your soul." Eliza felt goosebumps rise on her arms. Beside her, her roommate Zoe whispered, "Dramatic much." But Eliza couldn't dismiss the feeling that she was standing at the edge of something monumental. That whatever Professor Wilson was about to share would force her to confront questions she'd been avoiding her entire life. What truths was she comfortable ignoring? What injustices had she witnessed but remained silent about? And most importantly, what was she willing to risk to stand for what she believed was right? Professor Wilson moved to a worn leather chair positioned center stage. He settled into it with the ease of someone returning to a familiar refuge. "This chair," he said, patting its arm, "has been with me for 40 years. It's heard every draft of every lecture I've ever given, including the one that in 1990 divided this campus and forced every person, student, faculty, and administrator alike to choose a side." He leaned forward, his expression grave. "The question I posed then is the same one I pose to you now. When facing a system built on centuries of inequality, is your silence a form of violence?" In the third row, the young man with crossed arms, Jason Porter, son of the university's largest donor, exhaled sharply. His father had warned him about Wilson, called him a rabble-rouser, a troublemaker disguised as an academic. Yet something kept Jason in his seat, a curiosity he couldn't quite suppress. Eliza found herself holding her breath, suddenly aware that whatever came next would demand a response, not just today, but in how she chose to live her life going forward. The moral weight of Professor Wilson's question settled on her shoulders like a mantle she hadn't known she was destined to wear. Professor Wilson reached for a weathered journal on the small table beside his chair. "Let me take you back to September 15, 1990, he said, opening the journal to a marked page. "To understand what happened then, and why it matters now, you need to know who I was before I became the man standing before you today." As he began to read from his journal, the lecture hall disappeared for Eliza. The words transported her through time, compelling her to confront not just Professor Wilson's truth, but her own. And in that moment, though she couldn't yet know it, the trajectory of her life and the lives of everyone in that hall shifted irrevocably. The year was 1990, and Marcus Wilson was a young professor with everything to lose. Fresh from completing his doctorate at Harvard, he had secured a coveted position at Westridge University, becoming only the third black professor in the history department. His office was little more than a converted storage closet, but to Marcus, it represented possibility, a foothold in an institution that people like him had been systematically excluded from for generations. "My office window faced the grand oak tree on the main quad," Professor Wilson read from his journal. "The same tree where, in 1923, a black groundskeeper named Joseph Miller was hanged by a group of students who were never identified, never charged, never punished. The university's official history omitted this event entirely. I learned of it only through the whispered stories passed down by the cafeteria workers and janitors, the invisible workforce that kept the university running while remaining unseen by most who walked its hallowed halls." In her seat, Eliza felt her chest tighten. She'd passed that oak tree daily since arriving on campus, had taken photos beneath it, had never known. I decided that my first major lecture would tell the story of Joseph Miller and the other untold histories of our institution, Professor Wilson continued. Not to shame or divide, but because I believed, still believe, that true education begins with honest reckoning. He closed the journal momentarily, looking up at the lecture hall with eyes that seemed to see beyond the present moment. What I didn't realize then was how many people preferred the comfort of sanitized history to the discomfort of truth, or how far they would go to maintain that comfort. Professor Wilson reopened the journal, but before he could continue, the lecture hall door opened. Heads turned as an elderly man with a cane made his way slowly down the aisle. Professor Wilson paused, a complex expression crossing his face: recognition, surprise, and something deeper that Eliza couldn't quite name. President Emeritus Harrington, Professor Wilson acknowledged, his voice carefully neutral. I wasn't expecting you today. The elderly man, who must have been well into his 80s, gave a tight smile. Some stories should be heard from all perspectives, Professor Wilson. He took an empty seat in the front row. The tension in the room thickened. Eliza glanced at Jason Porter, whose posture had become even more rigid. Then back at Professor Wilson, who seemed momentarily thrown off balance by this unexpected arrival. But the professor quickly recovered, turning a page in his journal. Perhaps you're right, Dr. Harrington. Context is everything. He found his place again and continued reading. September 28, 1990. Tomorrow I deliver the lecture that will either establish my voice at this university or end my career before it truly begins. Dean Lancaster called me to his office today, strongly suggesting I reconsider my topic. There are more constructive ways to contribute to our academic community, he said, not quite making eye contact. Ways that don't reopen old wounds. I asked him whose wounds he was concerned about. He had no answer. The corner of Professor Wilson's mouth twitched slightly as he looked up. Richard Lancaster went on to become President Lancaster. He served for 15 years before retiring. Dr. Harrington here was his predecessor. From the front row, Dr. Harrington cleared his throat but said nothing. The day of the lecture arrived, Professor Wilson continued. September 29, 1990, the hall was fuller than expected. Faculty members lined the back wall. I recognized members of the Board of Trustees, and in the center of the front row sat President Harrington himself, arms crossed, expression inscrutable. The current Professor Wilson's eyes met those of the elderly man sitting before him, a moment of connection across decades. I began exactly as I planned, with the story of Joseph Miller. I showed photographs that I'd discovered in the archives of the local black newspaper, the Freedom Voice photographs the university had never acknowledged. I shared letters from Miller's widow demanding an investigation that never came. And then I connected his story to the broader pattern of institutional silence about racial violence, not just at our university, but across American higher education. Professor Wilson set down his journal, no longer reading but recounting from memory. Halfway through my lecture, President Harrington stood up and walked out. 3 board members followed. By the end, half the faculty had left as well. He paused. But every student stayed, every single one. In the present-day lecture hall, a palpable tension had built. Eliza felt caught in the gravitational pull of a story that was still unfolding, even after 30 years. What happened next? And why was former President Harrington here now, listening to Professor Wilson recount this clearly painful history? The moral question hung in the air, impossible to ignore. When confronted with uncomfortable truths about institutions we love and belong to, do we walk away to preserve our comfort? Or do we stay, bear witness, and accept the responsibility that comes with knowledge? Professor Wilson leaned forward in his chair, his gaze intense. The choices we made then, all of us, continue to ripple through this university today, through your education, through your understanding of what this institution is and what it could be. He turned to the elderly Harrington. Isn't that right, Mr. President? Dr. Harrington's lined face remained impassive, but his knuckles whitened around the handle of his cane. The confrontation of past and present hung in the balance, and with it, the power of truth to either heal or deepen wounds that had never fully closed. The oak tree on Westridge University's main quad had stood for over 200 years, witnessing the institution's evolution from a small seminary to a prestigious university. In 1923, it had witnessed horror. In 1990, it had stood silent sentinel as the aftermath of Professor Wilson's lecture transformed the campus. And now, in the present day, its sprawling branches cast dappled shadows across the pathways where students hurried between classes, largely unaware of the history beneath their feet. Professor Wilson set his journal aside and rose from his chair, moving to the edge of the stage. After my lecture, he said, I returned to my office to find my door vandalized with racial slurs. My research files had been dumped on the floor. On my desk was a note that read simply, "Know your place." A murmur rippled through the lecture hall. Eliza felt sick. Beside her, even Zoe had stopped fidgeting with her phone, fully engaged now in the professor's story. The following Monday, the student newspaper ran an editorial calling for my termination, arguing that I had sown division and tarnished the university's reputation with unverified historical claims. Professor Wilson's expression remained composed, but the muscle in his jaw tightened. The editorial was accompanied by a statement from President Harrington expressing grave concern about my approach to historical discourse. From the front row, Dr. Harrington shifted in his seat but remained silent. "I was summoned to a disciplinary hearing," Professor Wilson continued. "The committee consisted of 5 senior faculty members and 2 administrators. I was informed that I had violated the university's code of conduct by failing to maintain appropriate academic standards and creating a hostile environment." He paused, letting the weight of these charges hang in the air. The university I had dreamed of joining, had worked my entire life to be part of, was telling me that truth itself was a violation. That my very presence, my black body standing at the podium speaking black history, aloud constituted hostility. In the third row, Jason Porter uncrossed his arms, his expression troubled. As the son of privilege, he had never had to question his right to occupy space to speak his mind to be heard. "But something unexpected happened," Professor Wilson said, his voice warming slightly. "Students began gathering outside the administration building, not dozens, but hundreds. They weren't all black students, in fact, most weren't. They carried signs that read, 'Truth is not hostile, and we stand with Professor Wilson.'" Professor Wilson's gaze swept across the present-day students. "They skipped classes. They camped out overnight. They wrote articles and gave interviews to local news. And among them was a sophomore named Catherine Hayes, who organized a research team to independently verify every claim I had made in my lecture." At the mention of this name, Dr. Harrington finally spoke. "My daughter," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "My own daughter led the protest against me." A stunned silence fell over the lecture hall. Eliza's mind raced. President Harrington's daughter had sided with Professor Wilson. The story was far more complex than she had initially assumed. Professor Wilson nodded. "Catherine Harrington Hayes, one of the brightest students I've ever taught. And yes, the daughter of then-President Harrington." He addressed the elderly man directly now. "She told me once that she didn't see her actions as betraying you, but as living up to the values you had taught her: intellectual integrity and moral courage." Dr. Harrington's eyes glistened. "She was always smarter than me," he said quietly. "Braver, too." The tension in the room shifted, not disappearing but transforming into something more nuanced, more human. "Catherine and her research team presented their findings to the Board of Trustees," Professor Wilson continued. "They had discovered additional evidence supporting my claims, evidence that had been deliberately excluded from the university archives, including a letter from President Carleton, who led the university in 1923, instructing the campus police to handle the Miller situation quietly and ensure no official record reflects poorly on our students." Professor Wilson returned to his chair, sitting down heavily. The disciplinary committee found itself in an impossible position. The evidence was irrefutable. The student protests were growing daily. National media had begun to cover the story. He picked up his journal again, turning to a dog-eared page. "October 18, 1990. President Harrington called me to his office today. I expected to receive my termination notice. Instead, he asked me to sit down. He looked tired, defeated. 'My daughter hasn't spoken to me in 2 weeks,' he said. 'Last night she asked me a question I couldn't answer. When did preserving the university's reputation become more important than pursuing truth?' He pushed a folder across his desk. Inside was a formal apology from the Board of Trustees, a promotion to associate professor with tenure, and a proposal for a new research center dedicated to studying the university's complete history, including its failures. Professor Wilson closed the journal and looked directly at Dr. Harrington. "You saved my career that day." Dr. Harrington shook his head. "No, Marcus, you and Catherine saved my soul." The confession hung in the air, transforming the lecture hall into a space of unexpected vulnerability and reconciliation. "But this isn't just a story about how I kept my job," Professor Wilson said, addressing the students again, "or about how President Harrington and I eventually became unlikely allies. It's about what happened next, about the generations of students who have moved through this university since then, and how one moment of moral courage rippled outward to change countless lives. He stood again, his presence commanding the room. Including many of yours, because the truth is, some of you are sitting in this room today precisely because of what happened in 1990. The diversity programs that brought you here, the scholarship funds that support you, the curriculum that challenges you, all of these grew from that moment of reckoning. Eliza felt tears welling in her eyes, understanding now why this lecture was legendary. It wasn't just a history lesson or a personal story. It was an invitation to see herself as part of something larger, a continuous struggle toward truth and justice that stretched backward and forward in time. But the work is far from complete, Professor Wilson continued, his voice taking on a new urgency. Every generation faces its own moral crossroads, its own uncomfortable truths that demand response. The question I'm posing to you today remains the same. When facing a system built on inequality, is your silence a form of violence? In that moment, Eliza knew with absolute certainty that she would never see the world or her place in it quite the same way again. The air in the lecture hall had grown thick with emotion as Professor Wilson paused, allowing his question to resonate with each student in their own way. Eliza felt a profound sense of discomfort, not because the question was offensive, but because it demanded an honesty she wasn't sure she was ready to face. "Let me tell you what happened in the years following that confrontation," Professor Wilson said, moving toward a table where a stack of faded manila folders lay waiting. "These are letters. Hundreds of them spanning 3 decades, from students whose lives were changed because they heard this story, because they witnessed or learned about that moment when our university chose truth over comfort." He opened the top folder and withdrew a letter, the paper yellowed with age. "This is from Michael Acaffer, class of 1992. He writes, 'Before your lecture, I had decided to drop out. As one of only 8 black students in the engineering program, I felt invisible at best, unwelcome at worst. But watching the university community reckon with its history showed me that change was possible, not easy, not guaranteed, but possible. I stayed. I graduated. I now lead a team at NASA developing technology for the Mars missions, and I tell your story to every young black engineer who comes through my program." Professor Wilson replaced the letter and selected another. From Rebecca Goldman, class of 1997. "I arrived at Westridge as a legacy student. My grandfather, father, and 2 brothers all graduated from here. I grew up on sanitized stories of university tradition and excellence. Your lecture and the changes that followed forced me to reconcile the institution I loved with its flawed reality. This dual vision, holding both love and criticism simultaneously, has defined my approach as a civil rights attorney." Jason Porter shifted in his seat, uncrossing and recrossing his legs. His father, too, had told him sanitized stories of Westridge tradition. He had arrived expecting to walk the same paths, join the same clubs, secure the same automatic respect that generations of Porters had enjoyed. Professor Wilson's narrative was forcing him to see his family legacy in a more complicated light. From David Chen, class of 2005, Professor Wilson continued, unfolding another letter. "I took your history of social movements class on a whim, needing a humanities credit. I expected dates and names to memorize. Instead, I found a framework for understanding my own power and responsibility. Today, as a state legislator, I think of your lecture whenever I'm faced with a politically costly but morally necessary vote." Professor Wilson returned the letters to their folder, his movements deliberate. "These voices represent just a fraction of the ripple effects. One moment of institutional reckoning, countless lives altered." He turned to Dr. Harrington. "Would you care to add your perspective on what followed, Mr. President?" The elderly man nodded, rising slowly to his feet with the aid of his cane. When he spoke, his voice was reedy but clear. "I was 62 when Professor Wilson delivered his lecture. I had dedicated my life to this university. I believed I was protecting it." He paused, looking down at his hands. "It took my daughter's courage, and Professor Wilson's, to show me that I was actually harming the very institution I loved by denying its full truth." Dr. Harrington turned to face the students directly. "The 3 years following that lecture were the most difficult and most rewarding of my career. We established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to document the university's history of exclusion and discrimination. We created scholarships for descendants of Joseph Miller and other black employees who had been exploited or harmed. We changed hiring practices, admissions policies, curriculum requirements." He smiled faintly. "I received many angry letters from alumni. Donations temporarily declined. Some called for my resignation. But gradually, something remarkable happened. A new kind of pride emerged in our community, not pride based on selective storytelling, but on our capacity to face our failures honestly and work toward genuine inclusion. Dr. Harrington's gaze found Professor Wilson's. My only regret is that it took a crisis to open my eyes, that Professor Wilson had to risk his career and endure hatred for simply telling the truth. Professor Wilson nodded in acknowledgement, then addressed the students again. This is where you come in. The question before you isn't whether you would have stood with the protesters in 1990. It's what uncomfortable truths you're willing to face today. What injustices exist now, in your time, that future generations will judge us for tolerating? He picked up a remote control and clicked it. Behind him, a screen descended from the ceiling and a series of images appeared. Melting glaciers, migrants at borders, prison statistics showing racial disparities, wealth inequality graphs, indigenous protests against pipeline construction. The specific challenges change. The moral imperative remains constant, Professor Wilson said. And make no mistake, silence is a choice. Inaction is a position. Neutrality in the face of injustice serves only those who benefit from the status quo. In the third row, Jason Porter felt a growing unease. His father's company owned significant shares in several private prison corporations. The family wealth that paid his tuition derived, at least in part, from a system of mass incarceration that disproportionately impacted black and brown communities. Was his presence at Westridge, his very privilege built on foundations as morally compromised as the university's past. Beside Eliza, Zoe whispered, "Heavy stuff." But Eliza barely heard her. She was thinking of her own family's journey, her grandparents who had fled China during the Cultural Revolution, her parents who had worked multiple jobs to secure her education, her own silence in the face of anti-Asian harassment because she didn't want to make trouble. What was her responsibility now, as someone benefiting from the courage of those who had come before? Professor Wilson seemed to read the shifting thoughts in the room. You're feeling uncomfortable. Good comfort is the enemy of growth, but discomfort without action is merely self-indulgence. He returned to his chair one more time, settling into it with a sigh that carried the weight of decades. I'm 63 now. I've taught thousands of students, published books, received awards, secured my place in academia. In many ways, I've become part of the very institution I once challenged. His expression grew contemplative. And that's the final lesson I want to share with you today. The work of justice is never complete. The moment you believe you've arrived, you've already begun to backslide. Every generation must renew the commitment to truth, to equity, to moral courage. Professor Wilson leaned forward, his gaze intensely focused. So I ask you now, not as your professor, but as a fellow traveler on this journey, what truth are you afraid to face? What silence are you choosing? And what would it mean for you, for others, for our shared future if you found the courage to speak? The question hung in the air, an invitation and a challenge wrapped in one. Eliza felt something shift inside her. A quiet realization that her education wasn't just about acquiring knowledge or skills, but about developing the moral capacity to use that knowledge responsibly in the world. Across the lecture hall, similar reckonings were taking place in the minds and hearts of students who had arrived expecting an ordinary lecture and found themselves instead at a crossroads of conscience. The silence that followed Professor Wilson's question wasn't empty, it was pregnant with possibility, with the potential energy of lives about to change course. Professor Wilson's words hung in the air, reverberating through the lecture hall like the lingering note of a bell. No one moved. No one spoke. The usual shuffle of backpacks and notebooks that signaled the approaching end of class was notably absent. In the front row, Dr. Harrington's eyes remained fixed on Professor Wilson, decades of shared history passing between them in silent understanding. The former adversaries turned reluctant allies had walked a long road together, transforming not just an institution, but themselves in the process. Finally, a hand rose tentatively from the middle of the hall. It belonged to Maya Washington, a sophomore political science major whose quiet brilliance often went unnoticed in a department that rewarded confident assertion over thoughtful reflection. "Professor Wilson," she said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, "you've shared how one lecture changed the university 30 years ago. But what about the backlash? You mentioned vandalism, threats. How did you find the courage to continue when it would have been safer, easier to back down?" The question cut to the heart of what everyone was wondering. It was one thing to admire moral courage in retrospect. It was another to cultivate it within oneself when facing real consequences. Professor Wilson nodded, acknowledging the essential nature of her question. "The truth," he said. "I was terrified. The night after my office was vandalized, I sat in my apartment considering resignation. I had student loans to repay, no family wealth to fall back on. No guarantee I'd find another position if Westridge fired me. He paused, his expression vulnerable in a way that surprised Eliza. This wasn't the confident, almost legendary figure who had commanded the room from the moment he entered. This was a human being recalling a moment of profound fear and doubt. What kept me going wasn't extraordinary courage, Professor Wilson continued. It was knowing I wasn't alone. It was Catherine Harrington knocking on my office door with 20 other students, offering to help clean up the mess. It was Professor Diane Rodriguez from Latinx Studies calling to say, "Your fight is my fight." It was the campus janitor, Mr. Jackson, quietly telling me that Joseph Miller had been his great-uncle and thanking me for speaking his name aloud in that hall. From his seat, Dr. Harrington nodded slowly. "Community," he said. "That's what I failed to understand at first." I saw Professor Wilson as a lone agitator. I didn't recognize that he was actually building a more authentic community by telling the whole truth, painful as it was. "Precisely," Professor Wilson agreed. "Moral courage rarely exists in isolation. We draw strength from those who came before us and those who stand beside us." He surveyed the room. "Who in your life forms your community of courage? Who helps you speak truth when silence would be easier?" The question landed differently with each student. Jason Porter thought of his mother, who had quietly established a scholarship fund for first-generation college students despite his father's objections. Zoe recalled her older sister attending Black Lives Matter protests even after their conservative parents threatened to cut off her tuition. Eliza remembered her grandmother whispering stories of resistance during the Cultural Revolution, stories too dangerous to record but too important to forget. "I want to add something," Dr. Harrington said, rising again with effort. "There's another side to this story that shouldn't be overlooked." He turned to face the students directly. "While Professor Wilson found his community of support, I found myself increasingly isolated. Board members who had been dinner guests in my home stopped returning my calls. Colleagues avoided eye contact in the faculty lounge. The alumni magazine published letters questioning my leadership." His voice grew reflective. "I tell you this not to elicit sympathy, but to illustrate an important truth. When you choose to protect comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths, you may preserve certain relationships, but at the cost of your integrity. And eventually, that loss of integrity isolates you more profoundly than any external rejection ever could." Professor Wilson watched his former adversary with a complex expression that mingled respect with lingering caution. "Dr. Harrington and I have had many conversations over the years about the price of moral choices, both the price of speaking up and the price of staying silent. Neither path is without cost." Another hand rose, this time belonging to Jason Porter. Eliza noticed a slight tremor in his fingers. "Sir," he said, addressing both professors, "my father sits on the board of trustees. He's told me a different version of what happened in 1990. Jason swallowed hard. "He says the university went too far in its reforms, that standards were lowered to achieve diversity quotas, that the reputation we built over centuries was compromised for political correctness." The room tensed. Professor Wilson's expression remained neutral, but Eliza thought she detected a flicker of pain in his eyes. "What would you say to that perspective?" Jason finished, his voice catching slightly. A heavy silence fell. Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Eliza held her breath, sensing that Professor Wilson's response would reveal as much about the present as it had about the past. "I'd say," Professor Wilson began carefully, "that your father's perspective reflects a particular understanding of what a university is for. If its primary purpose is to preserve tradition and maintain the status quo, then yes, what happened after 1990 represented a kind of loss." He paused. "But if a university exists to pursue truth and prepare students to build a more just society, then what some experienced as loss, others experienced as long overdue correction." Dr. Harrington cleared his throat. "May I?" When Professor Wilson nodded, he turned to Jason. "Young man, I once shared your father's view. I believed that excellence and inclusion were somehow at odds, that to achieve one, we had to compromise the other." The elderly man's gaze swept across the lecture hall, taking in the diverse faces of students who would never have been admitted to Westridge during his early years as president. "I was wrong. Our academic rankings have risen since 1990, not fallen. Our graduates are more successful than ever, not despite our commitment to equity, but because of it. The fullness of human potential cannot be realized when we exclude or marginalize entire groups based on characteristics they cannot change." Jason's expression remained troubled, but something in his posture had shifted. The defensive crossing of arms had given way to a more open, if still uncertain, stance. "I encourage you," Professor Wilson said gently, "to consider that both your father's perspective and the counter-narrative I've presented today can simultaneously exist. The challenge of ethical growth is learning to hold multiple truths in tension without prematurely resolving the discomfort they create." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the hall. This was not the simplistic call-out culture many students had experienced on social media. This was an invitation to something more nuanced, more demanding, and ultimately more transformative. Eliza found herself raising her hand before she had fully formed her question. When Professor Wilson nodded to her, she took a deep breath. "You've shown us how one moment of moral courage changed this institution," she said. "But how do we know which battles are worth fighting? In a world with so many injustices, how do we choose where to focus our limited energy and resources?" Professor Wilson smiled, recognizing the earnest struggle behind her question. "That may be the most important question of all," he said, "and I don't have a formula to offer you. What I can share is this: pay attention to what disturbs your peace. Notice where your sense of justice is most acutely triggered. Trust that these internal signals may be guiding you toward your particular contribution." He stepped down from the stage, moving into the aisle that divided the lecture hall. "Some of you will work for systemic change through policy and law. Others will create art that awakens empathy and imagination. Some will build alternative economic models, heal bodies and minds, educate the next generation, protect the natural world." Professor Wilson's voice grew passionate. "The form your moral courage takes will be as unique as your fingerprint. The question isn't whether you'll find perfect clarity about where to focus. You won't. The question is whether you'll respond to the clarity you do have, however partial, however evolving." As he spoke, Eliza felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. She didn't need to solve every injustice or know her exact path forward. She simply needed to begin where she was with what she knew, taking one step and then another toward a more just world. "Before we conclude today," Professor Wilson said, returning to the stage, "I want to acknowledge something important. We've focused primarily on racial justice in this lecture because that was the particular moral challenge that defined my early career. But the principles we've discussed apply to all forms of systemic inequality and exclusion." He gestured toward Dr. Harrington. "When President Harrington established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 1990, it quickly became apparent that we needed to examine not just racial discrimination, but also the university's history regarding gender, sexuality, disability, religion, and socioeconomic status." Dr. Harrington nodded. The work expanded organically. "Once we committed to telling the full truth about one aspect of our history, we couldn't justifiably remain silent about others. This is another key lesson," Professor Wilson emphasized. "Justice is intersectional. When we address one form of oppression while ignoring others, we merely rearrange the architecture of exclusion rather than dismantling it entirely." From the back of the hall, a voice called out without raising a hand. "So you're saying we should focus on everything at once?" "That seems impossible." Professor Wilson considered the question. "Not exactly. I'm suggesting that while each of us may focus our active work in particular areas based on our gifts, positions, and experiences, we should remain aware of how different forms of injustice interconnect. And we should build coalitions across difference rather than competing for limited resources or attention." He moved toward his chair once more, signaling that the lecture was drawing to a close. "In the final analysis, the moral challenge before each generation remains fundamentally the same. Will we perpetuate systems of advantage and exclusion that we inherited but did not create? Or will we accept the discomfort and risk of transformation, personal and institutional, to build a world where all people can flourish?" The question hung in the air, not as an abstract philosophical query, but as a concrete invitation to each person in the room. "I don't know what specific moral crossroads you will face in your lifetime," Professor Wilson said, his voice softening. "But I know they will come. And when they do, I hope you'll remember this day. I hope you'll remember that moral courage is not about having perfect clarity or certainty. It's about being willing to act with integrity even amid doubt, complexity, and fear." He gathered his journal and notes, tucking them into a worn leather satchel. "Class dismissed," he said. "But our conversation has just begun." As students began to gather their belongings, Professor Wilson added, "For those interested in continuing this discussion, the Truth and Reconciliation Center hosts weekly dialogues on Thursdays at 7 p.m. and I hold extended office hours every Monday afternoon specifically for conversations that don't fit neatly into our curriculum. Eliza made a mental note of both opportunities, already knowing she would attend. Something had awakened in her during this lecture, a hunger for deeper understanding, a restlessness with the status quo, a glimmering sense of her own capacity to effect change. As the lecture hall gradually emptied, three distinct groups formed. Students clustered around Professor Wilson with follow-up questions. Another group approached Dr. Harrington, perhaps curious about his perspective as someone who had initially resisted change. And a third group huddled in intense conversation among themselves, already processing and debating what they had heard. Eliza found herself drawn to the third group, where Jason Porter was engaged in heated but respectful dialogue with Maya Washington and several other students. As she joined them, she heard Jason say, "I'm not saying my father is right about everything. I'm just trying to understand how to honor his perspective while forming my own." "That's actually a really good question," Maya responded. "How do we respect where we came from while still allowing ourselves to evolve?" Their conversation continued as they moved out into the hallway, their voices animated with the energy of genuine intellectual engagement. Eliza fell into step beside them, adding her own thoughts to the discussion, already feeling the transformative power of Professor Wilson's lecture rippling outward through their exchange. Behind them in the now empty lecture hall, Professor Wilson and Dr. Harrington remained, two old men with a complicated shared history, sitting side by side in the quiet aftermath of memories revisited. "They're a promising group," Dr. Harrington said, nodding toward the departing students. "They always are," Professor Wilson replied. "Each cohort carries its own possibility." "Do you think they'll do better than we did?" the former president asked. Professor Wilson considered this. "I think they'll do differently, face different challenges, make different mistakes." He smiled faintly. "But yes, I believe they carry forward what we learned at such great cost, and perhaps they'll start from a place that took us decades to reach." Dr. Harrington nodded, struggling to his feet with the aid of his cane. "That's all we can hope for, isn't it? Not perfection, but progress." The two men made their way slowly toward the exit, the younger supporting the elder's elbow as they navigated the steps. "Same time next year, Marcus?" Dr. Harrington asked as they reached the door. "Same time next year, Richard," Professor Wilson confirmed. The story continues. Outside, beneath the spreading branches of the ancient oak tree, groups of students lingered, their conversations spilling over from the lecture hall into the bright autumn afternoon. They moved in the dappled light and shadow, unaware that they walked on ground both hallowed and haunted by history, and equally unaware that, in ways large and small, they were already beginning to make history of their own. As Eliza joined a circle forming on the grass, she glanced back at the lecture hall just in time to see Professor Wilson and Dr. Harrington emerging into the sunlight. The sight of them together, once adversaries, now companions in a shared journey toward truth, filled her with an unexpected hope. If they could find their way toward reconciliation and common purpose despite such profound differences, perhaps there was hope for all the seemingly unbridgeable divides in the larger world. She turned back to the conversation unfolding around her, ready to listen, to speak, to begin the lifelong practice of moral courage that Professor Wilson had illuminated. The oak tree rustled overhead, its leaves catching the late afternoon light, bearing witness to one more generation grappling with the essential questions of justice, truth, and responsibility that define the human experience across time. In that moment, though she couldn't have articulated it fully, Eliza understood that she had crossed a threshold. The lecture had not simply imparted information, it had extended an invitation to a different way of being in the world, and she had accepted. The ripples continued outward, touching life after life, story after story, generation after generation, a testament to the enduring power of truth spoken with courage and received with an open heart. If you've been moved by this exploration of moral courage and the power of truth to transform lives and institutions, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support enables us to continue creating stories that challenge, inspire, and spark meaningful conversation. What uncomfortable truth have you confronted in your own life? How did it change you? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Until next time, remember, the path of moral courage is rarely comfortable, but it's always worthwhile. Thank you for journeying with us through this story.